Before we descend into tonight's nightmare, don't forget to like, subscribe, and join me twice a week for original tales born from the deepest, darkest pits of my mind. Welcome to Voices in the Dark. The first thing I remember is the taste of iron, sweet and thick. It wasn't just blood. It was a metallic, coppery presence that coated the back of my throat, clinging to my tongue. I woke in the deep, absolute dark, and I knew my teeth were broken before I even touched my tongue to them. The damage was extensive, sharp edges, a ragged hole where an incisor used to be. The pain was a low, constant hum, a throbbing ache that felt less like an injury and more like the ground after a train passes, a residual vibration of violence. I was lying on my side, my cheek pressed to something sticky and cold. It smelled faintly of bleach and something rotten, like old meat. When I tried to move, my wrists screamed. Zip ties, thick black plastic, were tight enough to cut off the blood flow. My hands were already numb, tingling with pins and needles that were rapidly turning into dull, heavy oblivion. I tried to scream, to call out, but the noise was soft and wet, muffled and absorbed by the thing in my mouth, a thick, soaked wad of fabric, perhaps an old sock or rag, fastened tight around my head. Panic began to claw its way up my throat, but the physical restraints held it back, trapping the terror inside my chest. Time is different in the dark. It doesn't move. It stretches and buckles, becoming shapeless and indifferent. The only way to mark it is by the cycles of pain and the brief, shuddering dreams that come between. My mind, desperate to escape the immediate reality, retreated. I remember the dreams more than I remember my life before. Hands, not human hands, but pale, slick things, coated with what looked like thick, dark syrup. A voice, muffled and far away, reciting a list of names like a prayer. Each name a dull, soft thud in the dark. A flickering, chaotic light, dancing on the edge of my vision, always just out of focus. I tried to grasp the dreams, to hold on to them, because they were the only things that weren't the dark and the pain. The darkness felt alive, pressing in on me, smelling of stale air and fear. I learned to breathe slowly through my nose, to conserve the air and keep the rising bile down. Hours passed, marked by the increasing severity of the pins and needles in my hands and the dull, burning ache of my jaw. I started to hallucinate in the silence, hearing faint dripping sounds that weren't real, seeing shapes in the non-existent light. I remember, too, the first time I saw his face. A heavy, grating sound of a deadbolt being thrown back ripped through the silence, making me jump. A strip of harsh, yellow light suddenly cut the room in half. He stood over me, silhouetted by a single bare bulb that hung just behind him. The light was violently bright, stinging my eyes after the long dark. He was tall, but his shoulders were hunched forward, like he was trying to fold himself in half, reducing his imposing height. His shadow stretched long and distorted across the floor. His skin was unnervingly pale, almost blue or gray in the harsh electric light, and his eyes were the color of wet gravel, flat, emotionless, and cold. He smiled at me. It wasn't a comforting gesture. It was a revelation. He showed teeth that were unnaturally small and too sharp, like a carnivore's. They were clean, white points against his blue-tinged lips. He crouched down, slowly, deliberately, his face coming close to mine. I smelled the rot on his breath, a deep, sickly, sweet scent, like decay mixed with cheap mints. It made my stomach lurch. "You're awake," he said. His voice was soft, almost conversational, a smooth tenor that didn't match the eyes or the teeth. "That's good." The sedative worked quicker than I thought it would. He reached out and stroked my hair, his fingers lingering on my scalp, moving slowly along the crown of my head. The touch was unnervingly gentle, almost affectionate, the way you might pet a docile animal. He pressed his thumb to the corner of my eye, a simple gesture, and I flinched violently away from the contact. "Shh." He made a soft, shushing sound, a quiet shh, shh. It was then I realized he was holding a knife. It was not a large weapon, just a simple hunting knife, but the blade was immaculate. It glinted, clean and sharp, reflecting the bare bulb as he traced the cold metal along my cheekbone, just beneath my eye. "Don't worry," he whispered, his voice dropping an octave, a conspiratorial sound. "I'm not going to hurt you. Not yet. We just need you comfortable." He stood, moved behind me, and cut the zip ties with one swift surgical motion. The plastic snapped, and blood rushed back into my hands. It wasn't a gentle process. It was a wave of agonizing, searing pain as circulation returned. My hands felt huge, heavy, and hot. I tried to pull them away, but he held my wrists, rubbing them gently with his thumbs, pressing into the marks the ties had left. He watched the red welts appear. When he was satisfied, he unbuckled the gag from the back of my head. My jaw ached instantly, and the taste of the fabric was overwhelming. I spat a mouthful of thick, dark blood onto the floor, tasting the shattered pieces of my own teeth. "Thirsty?" he asked, without changing his expression. He held out a bottle of water, a cheap plastic thing, the cap already unscrewed. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed it, my hands shaking violently, and drank. It tasted like cheap plastic and heavy chlorine, but it was salvation. When I finished, gulping the last drops, he wiped the wetness from my mouth with the back of his hand. Another strangely intimate gesture. "My name is Walter," he said. He placed the knife carefully on the floor beside his foot. "You're going to stay here with me for a while. We'll get to know each other." He stood up, gave one last look that held no curiosity, no malice, and no pity, just observation. He walked away, pulling the heavy steel door shut, plunging me back into the dark, and leaving me alone with the pain and the echo of his voice. The room was small, maybe 8 feet by 8 feet, a concrete box lined for a specific purpose. There was a thin, stained mattress on the floor in one corner, stained and stinking with old, dark blood and human waste. The walls were lined with thick, clear plastic sheeting, stretching from floor to ceiling, duct-taped meticulously at every seam. It was a crude, makeshift liner, designed to make cleaning easy. A single bare bulb, the source of the blinding light, hung from the ceiling by a wire, buzzing like a trapped, frantic wasp. There were no windows. The only door was heavy and metal, thick as a safe, with a massive deadbolt and a separate latch handle on the outside. Walter brought me food twice a day. The schedule was irregular, but always signaled by the wrenching sound of the lock. It was always the same. Cold canned beans, stale crackers, sometimes a gray, thin slice of lunch meat. He never used a plate. The food was simply dropped on the floor next to me. He watched me eat. His posture was unsettlingly relaxed, leaning against the door frame, his eyes never leaving my face, following every bite, every chew. Sometimes he would talk to me. He never asked me any questions about myself. He didn't care who I was or where I came from. Instead, he would offer up mundane details about his own life, stories about his childhood, his boring job at the post office, the predictable plot lines of his favorite TV shows. He seemed to use these stories not to connect, but as a kind of sonic wallpaper, filling the silence while confirming my absolute lack of importance. I was just a thing, a pet, something to be kept and fed and watched. The cycles of his visits became my only calendar. Sometimes his eyes would glaze over, and he would stare past me for long minutes, completely still. Those were the worst times. At night when he was gone, I heard noises through the walls. The house was not empty. I heard screaming, sometimes muffled, sometimes sharp and cut short. Sometimes there was laughter, a thin, high-pitched, hysterical sound that sounded like glass breaking. Other times it was the repetitive, rhythmic thudding sound of something heavy hitting the floor. Walter would leave for hours at a time, sometimes an entire night. When he came back, he was often covered in blood. It wasn't the spray of fresh violence, it was dark, crusting, and smeared onto his shirt, his forearms, sometimes speckling his pale face. He would wash himself in a utility sink located just outside the metal door in the small corridor. I could hear the tap running, the loud sloshing of water, and his voice humming softly to himself as he scrubbed his hands and arms until they were raw. He seemed utterly calm after these episodes. Once, he brought in a woman. He threw open the door and the light hit her face. She was unconscious, her face swollen and purple, her hair wet with sweat. He laid her gently on the mattress next to me, almost tenderly, and stroked her hair until her eyes fluttered open. When she saw me, her eyes widening in immediate shared horror, she started to sob. A quiet, broken sound. Walter shushed her, rocking her head with his hands, holding her like a small child. He gave her a sip of water. That night, the thudding started again after he took her away. I never saw her again, but the memory of her face, of her immediate despair, stayed with me. I tried to keep track of the days by scratching faint marks into the plastic-lined wall with my fingernails. I needed to know how long I had been here. After a full week, the pain in my fingers from the zip ties was so intense that I lost count. The effort of counting became exhausting. After 2 weeks, I stopped caring about the days entirely. Time became a single, static state of being trapped. One morning, the routine changed. Walter brought me a present. He was unusually animated, his movements quick and jerky, his eyes bright and feverish with a strange kind of excitement. He set a small, grimy cardboard box on the floor near my feet and opened it with a clumsy flourish. Inside was a kitten. It was black and white, tiny and malnourished, its fur matted and filthy. It looked terrified. He lifted it out, holding it awkwardly by the scruff of its neck, and held it up to my face. "For you," he said, the softness back in his voice. "You looked lonely. Everything needs a companion." He set the kitten gently on the corner of the mattress. It was trembling, but it curled up against my side, its small body radiating a fragile, welcome warmth. It began to purr, a rough, loud engine sound against the silence. I stroked its small back, feeling the delicate bones beneath the fur. And for a fleeting moment, I felt a sharp, almost painful sensation of hope. It was a small, living thing that wasn't him. I named it Mouse. I fed it tiny, water-soaked scraps from my meals, hiding the food from him under my hand, and let it sleep against my chest. Walter watched us together, sitting in the corner, his head tilted to one side, like he was observing a strange chemical reaction and trying to understand what he was seeing. He watched me talk to it. He watched me share my water. He never touched the cat himself. The presence of Mouse gave me a reason to wake up. I had to protect it. I had to survive to keep this small, warm thing alive. One morning, the purring didn't start. I woke to a terrible stillness. Mouse was dead. Its small neck was broken, snapped cleanly. Its body was still warm against my ribs. It had been killed hours before I woke. Walter was sitting in his usual corner, his knees drawn up to his chest, his eyes fixed on the far wall. There was no blood, no obvious violence, just the terrible finality of the broken neck. I picked the kitten up and held it. The grief was sudden and absolute, like a punch to the gut. This was his message. I control everything. I control what you love. Why? I whispered, the sound cracking in the stale air. He shrugged, a small, negligent movement of his massive shoulders. It was time. It started to look too healthy. You were getting too attached. I tried my best not to cry so that Walter wouldn't see how much pain it caused me. I gently placed Mouse onto the mattress because that was the only place that would be out of sight. I started to plan. At first, it was just a way to pass the time, something to keep my mind from unraveling into the madness Walter was trying to force upon me. I was no longer an animal to be fed. I was a mind to be protected. I watched Walter intensely. I mapped his routines. The keys. He always locked the door with 2 heavy, loud clicks. But sometimes, especially when he was agitated or in a hurry, he left the entire ring of keys hanging on a small, rusty hook by the utility sink just outside my door. A critical air of speed over caution. The weapon. He always carried the hunting knife, but he never searched me. He never considered me a threat, just a commodity. I began to hide things. A shard of hard, smooth plastic from a broken plate he'd discarded. A 6-inch length of thick wire I painstakingly pulled from the coils of the derelict mattress springs. A long, rusting nail I pried free from the floorboards beneath the thin layer of concrete dust. I wrapped these small tools in a scrap of the fabric from the mattress and tucked them deep inside the shredded hem of my filthy pants, held in place by a strip of stiff duct tape I managed to peel from the plastic lining. I practiced picking the lock on the heavy metal door. I couldn't risk making a sound, so I had to work entirely by feel, guided by the memory of the shape of his keys. I would hold the wire in the plastic shard and try to find the pins inside the mechanism, day after day, waiting for the sound of his footsteps to mask my efforts. I waited for my chance, knowing it would be the only one I would ever get. It came sooner than I expected. Walter was in a massive hurry that night. I heard the muffled screaming start earlier and louder than usual. He threw my cold beans at me, literally tossing the bowl in, and then he turned to leave, not bothering to check the bolt. He must have heard a noise, or perhaps he was simply too excited by his other activities. He left the full ring of keys dangling on the hook outside the door. He didn't even bother to lock the door behind him. I waited. I counted to 100, then I waited 10 more minutes until I heard his heavy, shuffling footsteps fade entirely down the concrete corridor. I crept to the door and peered out through the small, high vent grate. The hallway was empty, dimly lit by a distant swinging bulb. The metal door wasn't locked. I pushed it open slowly, careful not to let the dry hinge squeal. I took the keys, a heavy, cold ring of brass, and slipped into the corridor. The house was a terrifying maze. The walls were covered entirely in the same thick plastic sheeting, stained with old, dark brown and black smears. The air was heavy, thick with the smell of decay, old disinfectant, and wet earth. I heard noises constantly from behind the other doors lining the hall. Muted thudding, the desperate, wet sound of something being cut, and low, whimpering prayers. I moved quickly, adrenaline overriding the pain in my body, keeping to the shadows. I found a staircase, narrow, wooden, and rickety, and climbed, every footfall a gamble. My heart pounded against my ribs, a loud, frantic drum. At the top of the stairs, I found the door. It was painted a stark, unnatural red. It was a normal house door, not the metal tomb of my room, but it was locked with 2 heavy deadbolts. I jammed the key ring into the lock, my hands shaking so violently I couldn't hold them steady. I tried the first key, then the second. The third one fit. I turned it, the mechanism grating loudly, and then turned the handle and pushed. The room was vast, an attic or a large basement that had been converted. It was filled with cages, small wire cages, the kind used for livestock or dogs, stacked on top of each other like macabre apartment buildings. Inside each one was a person. The sight stole my breath, silencing the noise of my fear. Some were alive, barely. Some were long dead. The living ones stared at me with hollow, defeated eyes, their mouths stuffed with rags, their limbs bent into uncomfortable shapes by the small confines. The dead ones were twisted into impossible forms, their limbs broken and disjointed. The smell was overwhelming, a cloying, sickly sweet rot that made me gag and double over. Then I recognized a face. It was the woman Walter had brought in, the one he had rocked like a child. She was alive, in the second row of cages. Her eyes met mine, wide, filled with a sudden, desperate plea. She shook her head, slow and deliberate, a movement that clearly cost her a great deal of effort. I understood the message. Don't make a sound. Don't let him know. I moved past the cages, walking on trembling legs. I couldn't free them. There wasn't time. I looked for another way out. There was a window, large but completely boarded up. The wood was old, warped. I seized the nail I had hidden and began to pry at the boards, working them free one by one. Quiet, focused movements. The wood shrieked slightly as the nail worked its way between the planks. I stopped, listened, then continued. When I had enough space, a narrow vertical gap, I squeezed through the opening. The sharp wood tore at my skin and the filthy clothes. I fell through the space and dropped 3 feet to the ground outside. I didn't look back. I didn't stop. I ran. I made it 3 blocks. My body, weak from weeks of poor food and terror, failed. My legs collapsed beneath me on the sidewalk and I hit the concrete hard, barely feeling the impact. A man walking his dog found me, a blur of concern and alarm. He called the police. They took me to the hospital, where the staff worked quickly, stitching up the cuts and scrapes, cleaning the old wounds, and finally giving me a sedative that pulled me down into a deep, merciful darkness. When I woke, I told them everything. I told them about the house, about Walter, about the plastic walls, and about the room full of cages. I described the street, the red door, and the utility sink. They listened, the police officers sitting by my bed, taking notes. But even through my pain and exhaustion, I could see the doubt in their eyes. I was just another crazy, malnourished patient, another junkie with a spectacular, unbelievable story. They sent officers to the address I gave them. They sent a forensic team. The house was empty. The rooms were clean, scrubbed down, smelling of air freshener and old soap. There was no plastic sheeting. There was no utility sink outside a metal door. There was no sign of Walter, or the cages, or the bodies, or the deep, sweet smell of decay. The only thing they found, the single item that made the newspaper's short column, was a single black and white kitten, clean and well-fed, sleeping calmly on a sunny windowsill. I felt like I was losing my mind. Did I imagine all of it? Was any of it real? How could there be no sign that the hell I was living in even existed? They had an explanation for my injuries. They said I was hit by a car while riding a bike, and that's how I broke my teeth and had the cuts on my body. But I don't even own a bike. At least I don't remember owning a bike. They let me go after 3 days. I went back to my apartment, changed the locks 3 times, and bought a cheap, heavy handgun. I tried to sleep, but the dreams kept coming. The taste of iron, the sudden silence after the screaming, the gentle, terrifying feeling of his hands on my skin. Sometimes, at night, when the streetlights are bright, I see Walter's face reflected in my window glass, just for a second. He's smiling at me with those sharp, small teeth. I know he's still out there, somewhere, waiting. And I know, when he comes back, I'll be ready.